For our episode on the military and politics, we talked to Aris Arugay, Professor of Political Science from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Here's our full interview.
Hello everyone, welcome to this special episode of podcast in our fourth season, Hindi na Bago Yan, where we try to discuss contemporary issues in Philippine politics from a broader historical perspective. So for today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Aris Arugay, Professor of Politics at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, as we try to get his insights on our topic for today, which is about the relationship between the military and politics in the Philippines. So hello, Aris. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Hi Aaron, thanks for the invitation at kinalulugod kong makasama mo dito sa episode ng podcast.
Okay. So sige, let's dive right into it. So siguro to start off, I just want to ask a very general question, 'di ba? Na parang siguro in an ideal world, can you share with us your thoughts on the role of the military in a particular society or maybe even in a democracy?
Right. Sige. Ang isang sabihin na natin militar, no, or minsan sa ating lengguwahe ang tawag sandatahang lakas, no, armed forces. Ang role niya, no, sa isang demokrasya ay ang pagpapatibay ng mga prinsipyo, norms at institutions nito. At ang key na prinsipyo ng isang demokrasya ay popular sovereignty. Na yung soberanya ay nasa tao at ang may kapangyarihan ay ang mga hinahalal, no, ng mga sibilyan. At pag sinabi nating sibilyan, hindi ito formal na parte, no, ng military. Kaya merong sa ating constitution that civilian authority is always supreme, no, over the military. Tinatawag natin civilian supremacy. And therefore, sa isang demokrasya or even in any modern state, the military is subservient, no, to civilian political authority. Kaya ang isang trabaho ng isang pangulo, no, o ang isang head of state ay commander-in-chief of the armed forces because ultimate authority over the military should not be given to the uniform. Kasi pag ganon, that means the military is already ruling rather than being the sinasabi natin coercive or violent arm of the state. At alam natin sa Politics 101 that ito yung esensya ng isang estado, di ba? The monopoly of the legitimate instruments of violence. Yung main instrument noon, yung militar. So, very critical yung role niya, no? Lalo na sa pagpapatibay ng integridad ng estado, no, laban sa mga kaaway na panlabas. So, doon makikita natin na in any democracy, no, the military ideally is in charge of yung tinatawag natin na national security. At pag sinabi nating national security, oftentimes ito ay ang pagpapatibay o pagdedepensa ng interes ng isang bansa, lalo na sa mga threats o sa mga sabihin na natin na maaring, no, maging mga kaaway ng bansa, no, na panlabas externally. Ngunit alam natin, batay sa ating karanasan at mamaya pag-uusapan pa natin to ng mas maigi, na while ito yung ideal, napakaraming demokrasya na mga bago at maraming mga bansa sa mundo, yung mga tinatawag natin na post-colonial states, na hindi ito yung trabahong ibinibigay sa military.
So, yun, no? So actually, I wanted to segue nga from that, diba? Kasi you mentioned that yung civilian supremacy and how the military is supposedly serving the people, basically, diba? So, pero hindi rin nga tayo naman remiss sa reality that in several parts of the world, we've seen how the military could be very much politicized, diba?
Right.
We've seen countries in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, for example, that has gone through military juntas, diba? No, so, and in the Philippine context, for example, balik tayo sa Philippines, diba? We've had a president who hails from the military, diba? Na si Fidel Ramos, and we've had several senators who were part of the military, diba? So siguro I'd like to ask you on that, diba? Na parang in that particular reality that we are living in, na kahit may ideal sense of the role of the military in a state and in society, paano sa Pilipinas? Ano yung picture nung papel ng military sa Pilipinas in our history? And can you cite some examples?
Right. May mga nagsasabi, may mga scholars, no, ng Philippine studies or Philippine politics na nagsasabi na mahalaga yung role ng kasaysayan sa pagbuo ng role ng military sa contemporary times at yung mismong behavior, no. May teorya na naglilink, no, ng historical na role na binigay sa military. Kasi kung titingnan natin yung kasaysayan ng ating military, kaiba sa mga kapitbahay natin. The Armed Forces of the Philippines, while it traces its origins with the Katipunan, the anti-Spanish colonial movement, officially, the Philippine Army, which is the first manifestation of the Philippine military, was created by Commonwealth Act number 1. And by virtue of this, is therefore a colonial army, meaning it was established by American colonial power. Although, yun nga, the AFP tries to put a myth in its creation by attaching itself to the Katipunan. But we all know formally, because the Katipunan wasn't a successful revolution. Unlike, for example, kung titingnan natin mga kapitbahay natin, Indonesia, for example, the Indonesian military traces its origins from the Dutch colonial struggle, and they won. And because of that, the Indonesian military is a liberation army. No? Tayo kasi colonial, meaning it was imposed it was created by the Americans. No? At dahil colonial army siya, no? It had no say on its role. No? In fact, its first mandates, or yung tinatawag natin missions, kasi military may mga mission, was against the hooks, was against domestic enemies, because the Americans were building military installations, no, in the Philippines, the biggest outside of the mainland, no, US. Subic and Clark would eventually become the biggest military installations when we were granted independence outside of US territory. No? At dahil doon, parang nagkaroon ng external defense shield ang Pilipinas. So parang sabi ng mga Americans, huwag nyo na problemahin yung external defense. Sagot na namin yan. No? Kaya lang, marami kayong kaaway sa loob. Kaaway, quote-unquote. Maraming threats sa Philippine Commonwealth and eventually the Philippine Republic. No? So, from the get-go, unfortunately, we did not satisfy the external defense mission normally given to the military. Very domestic-oriented yung ating military from the get-go. No? Kaya kung titignan mo, diba, the hooks became the PKP and then became the... Kaya yung mahaba yung hugot. No? Kaya ka ngayon merong NTF-ELCAC kasi the military is still fighting its original enemy that was imposed by American colonial power. So, in other words, if you notice, no, while in our Constitution, it says that the Armed Forces of the Philippines is the protector of the state and its people. Actually, malaking debate yon, no? Kasi in other countries, hindi nila nilalagay yon because that's an entry point for politicization. No? Because the military can then determine whether a government is still serving the people, and if it does not, no, parang sinasabi ng Constitution, part of your duty is to protect the people from oppressive governments, which is, no, you cannot find in the constitutions of other modern democracies, because the military is a non-deliberative institution, meaning it cannot even get to that point to judge the legitimacy of governments, because it should not deliberate. It should merely follow
The
civilian
commander-in-chief,
authority.
yeah.
Exactly.
It's like a gateway to a military junta enshrined in
Right.
the Constitution.
Exactly. And ito yung ginagamit na basehan. And if you notice, all the military adventures in politics, kasi sabi ko nga, the Philippines might be the only country wherein the military did not successfully stage a coup, yung military initiated. No? Kasi the only successful military intervention in political crisis that the military has done was during EDSA 2. EDSA 1 was not. EDSA 1 was a failure, di ba? It was an aborted coup. No, so it's the only country wherein the military is politicized and powerful despite not staging a successful coup ever in its history.
So, what do you think makes it so? Na bakit kaya? Bakit kahit wala siyang successful that idea na they saved quote unquote the people from an oppressive government. Kahit wala siyang ganong pinaguhugutan.
Right.
Why has it seemed that the military has been so politicized in the Philippines?
Right. Sa ibang bansa kasi, lalo na yung mga liberation armies, no, like Indonesia, Egypt, no, and some countries in Latin America, the military predated the state. Meaning, yung liberation army, mas nauna sa estado. At dahil mas nauna sila sa estado, parang sinasabi ng militar na kanong klaseng military is, mas matanda kami sa estado, even the Myanmar military, no, kaya rin sila very intrusive sa politika, is because the state would not be possible without us. So therefore, we have a veto on state affairs. No? If we feel that the government is no longer serving the people, then meron yung tinatawag silang moderating power. Nakikita natin yun sa Latin America. However, in comparison to Thailand and Myanmar, sa Latin America, pa nagkudeta yung military, they go back to barracks. Meaning, they just settle the disputes among politicians and then they go back to barracks. And then they'll just intervene again pag nag-aaway-away na naman yung mga politiko. In Southeast Asia, hindi. Di ba? They become the government. Sa atin, what accounts for this interventionist tendency and this highly politicized military, babalik ako doon sa roles na binigay sa kanya. Because the more domestic, at comparatively, if you look at other countries, the more domestic ang nature ng military missions, the more politicized it gets. No? Kasi kung yung military nakikita na ba't ang daming kurakot na politiko? Bakit? So because not everyone is attracted to serve in the military. It might sound romanticized, but some people are really driven, no, by values, by love of country, di ba? Patriotism, loyalty, duty. And then they see the civilian politicians who are supreme over them are actually the ones causing the problem. So may individual na ganong dynamic, no, at the level of the individual officers. But institutionally, no, kasi iniiba natin yun minsan no? Because the military is still a corporate institution. Yung kanilang pagiging politicized has also something to do with the inability of civilian governments to professionalize the military. Because some civilian politicians wants a politicized military kasi pwede nilang gawing instrumento in their political agendas. No? So dito papasok whether yung politician mo is really thinking of the national interest, meaning a military that's professional, that's oriented toward external defense, or a military that is politicized and therefore pwede nyong gamitin as a weapon against your political enemies, no? As we have seen, in fact, no? In civilian governments, particularly, no, during martial law and even after martial.
So, di ba parang yun nga, nabanggit mo na when martial law was imposed, yun talaga yung nangyari, di ba? Na the military was used against the people, basically, di ba? So, lalo na dun sa opponents of Marcos. And it seemed that it has persisted, di ba? Na ganun in the contemporary history of the Philippines. Especially, for example, during Duterte's time, for example, diba? We've had several members of the military, either retired or actively in service, that were being tapped to serve in several key positions in government, lalo na nung COVID-19 pandemic, diba? No? So, ito yung gusto ko ding itanong sa'yo, diba? Na parang, it's one thing when the military is trying to be intrusive in politics as the military. But what happens when the military crosses the border and actually becomes the person in government? Diba? Na parang, should that be a cause of concern? And if it's supposed to be a cause of concern, why? Diba?
Over time, no, nakita yung martial law kasi very institutionalized, no, yung participation ng military. In fact, Marcos called the military a partner in national development. So, in terms of martial law, you only have a civilian, quote-unquote, head, but actually the regime itself was highly militarized. No? Ganun din sa Latin America. No? Pinochet would eventually become a civilian, and therefore the Chilean regime was no longer a military junta, but the military was still there. Fast forward tayo post-martial law. No? So ano yung nangyari? What basically happened across, no, these administrations was that sabi ko nga, no, there was really a lack of attention to professionalizing the military. No? Meron kasing teorya, no, sa civil-military relations that a more modern, capable, meaning in terms of equipment, in terms of training, in terms of the more the military is has those. No? It's modernized, it's highly capable. The more that it's focused on its external mission, the less politicized it becomes. No? Unfortunately, post-martial law, the Philippines is one of the most underfunded militaries in Asia. So dito papasok that we were not, and I know some people might give us a hard time, give me a hard time by saying na, teka, ang ibig mo sabihin, dapat pinupondohan natin yung military. No? Isn't that isn't that an anathema to democracy when you have...
Parang incentivizing pa yung
right,
role
right.
nila.
Parang, let's give them toys so that they won't meddle in politics. No? But ang ano kasi doon is that you are giving the military the means to really perform its ideal mission, which is external. Kaya sa akin, unless we're really secured about our national interest, calling for the abolition of the military is a big no-no for me, because I would want a military that's more externally focused, no? That's really guarding the territorial integrity of the republic. No? Kaya lang hindi nga ganun eh. However, Aaron, ang nakikita natin is that yung phenomenon ng retired generals, no? Sinabi mo nga, during the time of Duterte, yun yung peak, because other administrations before, meron naman eh, pero manaka-naka. No? So for example, to my count, there has only been 4 secretaries of national defense since 1986, 1987, after martial law, that has no military background. Orly Mercado, Nonong Cruz. I won't count Gloria Arroyo because she served concurrently as president and DND secretary. No, Bert Gonzales, and I mentioned noon, and Gibo Chodoro. No? So they had no military background, meaning they did not go to PMA. They did not get any ranks from the police or the military. But the rest are all retired generals, no? Retired chief of staff. And during the time of Duterte, this spilled over a lot of cabinet portfolios that normally you would not give to the military. Saan ka nakakita DSWD Secretary Military? Saan ka nakakita peace process? Saan ka nakakita environment? No? And ang sabi ko nga, may multiplier effect yan. When you appoint a retired general to head a cabinet agency, he brings forth his PMA batch or everyone who worked under him when he was still a military commander. So may multiplier effect. Malaking debate yan. Some people believe na pag retired civilian na. Kasi hindi na naka-uniform di ba? Hindi na siya officially part. But the counter to that is in countries wherein formal institutions and formal norms on governance are not yet established, may blurring of boundaries between the formal and informal. So I normally get a lot of grief from the military training institutions wherein I'm sometimes invited. Every time, sila naman yung nagtatanong parang, sir, Prof, ano bang opinion nyo sa retired? No? Is this the militarization of a cabinet or a government? Sabi ko, yes. At sabi na, teka, sir, retired na. Sabi ko, I give you two counter arguments. First, the military mind is still there, regardless of whether you're retired or not. No? Tayo, pa nag-retire tayo as academics, we will still have an academic mind. You cannot take that out. And second, yung sinasabi ko kanina, is the network. The network is still there. No? So, no amount of being retired can take that. Ang tanong kasi dito, what is the implication on the civilian bureaucracy? No? At from what I gather, lalo na during the Duterte administration, it really regresses the development of our bureaucracy. Kasi papalitan naman pala sila ng ex-military and it somehow gives the military a signal that they all have second careers. Some of my students in military training institutions, pag tinatanong mo sila, they already have second careers thinking about it. No? Pero bakit nagiging employment agency sila ng gobyerno? No? Why can't they just enjoy their retirement?
Exactly. No? So actually yun nga yung sinabi mo rin nga na they bring in the network. I think that's a very important point that we need to highlight. Kasi 'di ba, parang hindi, when you retire, you doesn't necessarily lose naman agad yung influence mo over people,
right?
Diba?
Oh yeah.
So the network that you have and the influence and the clout that you've built while serving in the military would still be there, diba? No? So right. Pero when that happens, diba, halimbawa, or for example, I'd like to pick your brain. For example, when Fidel Ramos became president, he was president and he was commander-in-chief and he was from the military. Diba? What will that, what does that have to do with what you're talking about a while ago na yung blurring ng effect when this time around, talagang siya mismo ay from the military?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, back then, when Ramos became president, he was no longer simply a former military general. No, he somehow has become an EDSA hero. And because of that, his civilianization is a bit more. He's an example for me of a military guy that has civilianized in a way, because if he was still very much embedded still within the military network, he could have appointed a dominate. Ang ironical dito, kung sino pa yung civilian mismo, sila pa yung naghihila ng mga military sa cabinet. Because if you're the military talaga and you're the president, you know the trade-off of appointing. One trade-off of appointing all these military generals is that they don't appreciate the plurality of views necessary for policy making. Kasi they're always on crisis mode. So quick fixes na kahit hindi pinag-iisipan, hindi yung repercussions and ramifications hindi pinag-iisipan. And then we've seen this in the Philippine pandemic response. IATF
At
was
sanay sila
dominated
dun
by
sa
military.
chain of
Yeah.
command thinking, diba? Na
Right.
parang when I give
But-
the orders, you follow.
Right. But not all, not every policy challenge, policy issue is a crisis.
Mm.
No?
Mm.
And we've seen that it requires a lot of thinking, not group think. It requires a lot of thinking from multiple perspectives. So yung diversity of views in a cabinet, yung diversity of views necessary for effective policy making, nawawala yon. And sabi ko nga kanina, the military is a non-deliberative institution.
Mm.
Nakikipag-debate ba sila sa kanilang superiors?
Mm.
No?
Yeah.
Compare that with academics.
Mm.
Diba? So, yun yung downside. And I think we need to emphasize that the benefits of appointing ex-military officials should be balanced with the possible limitations.
Mm.
Kasi
Yeah.
they're not really trained, I'm sorry, to lead. They're trained to follow. Diba? And then you're gonna put them in leadership positions. You observe Duterte's cabinet meetings recorded. No? Walang discussion. Puro briefing, and then they all say yes, Mr. President. Yes, sir. No? And this is why this is the state of our policy making.
Yeah, so pero humor me with this na parang kasi you hinted a while ago that there could be some upsides to it, diba? Meron ba? Can you share?
One thing is that yun nga, in crisis situations, the military is trained to respond. And that requires a lot of simplification. No? If you put an academic in a crisis position, ano yan, magsusulat ng RRN muna bago i-analyze. No? So that's one side. And this is why in crisis situations, the military is often asked for input. No? The other thing is, yun nga, obedience. No? So if you're a president, you're a leader, you simply want people to just merely follow you, not challenge you, not really tell you the lay of the land and the likely repercussions, then you appoint them. So I guess that's what the Duterte presidency wants. He even admitted that he likes the military for its efficiency. No? But I think the past 5-6 years have shown us that there's a downside to just emphasizing efficiency on everything. Because you can be efficient, but you're not effective.
Or you're not doing something right, diba?
Right, right. You're just simply doing something for something's sake. Para lang may masabing may nagawa ka. Diba? At nakita natin yun sa pandemic response. These absurd policies.
Yeah.
Treating the COVID-19 as if it's a traditional military security threat. Well, you have to incarcerate people. The people are the problem when the virus is a problem. Deploying the police donned in military fatigue, in military uniforms, na may mga barel. Ano yung babarilin yung virus?
Correct.
I mean,
yeah.
So yun ganun, because that's the toolkit of the military. They're not really trained for highly complex, multifaceted security, human security challenges like a pandemic.
Na continuously evolving, diba? No?
Exactly.
So,
yun. So yung pa, no? So I mean, at the end, the militaries might be highly efficient, might be highly obedient, but it also has its limits in appreciating the complexity of governance challenges and problems.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. No? So, of course, we are in the context of the elections, diba? So, we've discussed that Duterte, in your words, siya yung peak nung pagkakaroon ng madaming appointees na retired.
Right. So far,
military.
siya yung peak. Yeah.
Siya yung peak, diba? No? So,
so far.
And right now, with all the candidates that we've had, diba? We have one, of course, that is with a military background na candidate rin natin. And we see now the sectors of the military also, 'di ba, although sometimes syempre under the radar, nakita naman na we all know that they have their own uh, candidates in mind, 'di ba? No? So pero I'd like to first zero in on the idea of paano natin ngayon makikita yung relationship ng military with the next president after having a Duterte administration entrenching the retired general so much in government.
Right. Duterte's administration has put a lot of the military's agenda front and center, no? Against terrorists, against communists, against and even even civil society organizations who are perceived to be aiding insurgents, no, nadamay na, no. And the promise is that they will end the communist insurgency by the time the Duterte administration steps down. It's only a couple of months more, 2 to 3 months, and this is not happening. So what does this mean? That again, the mission is unfinished. So, but the military saw, because Duterte is the first president to really unconditionally side with the military on these issues. So the military will make sure, or at least will want, a similar president, no? Because this mission is unfinished. You're talking about the only military in Southeast Asia who has never been victorious in a war that it has waged in its history. No? Although pag sinasabi ko yan sa mga military students ko, nagagalit sila because yun nga, how dare you tell that to us? But I'm just merely stating a historical fact. No? It wasn't victorious against the Spanish, against the Americans, against the Japanese. Although tinulungan nila, of course, yung USAPE, no? But across post-independence, no? We have the longest running Maoist-inspired insurgency in the world, if not in Asia. No? So, unlike in other countries like our neighbors, either they became governments or they were vanquished. The Philippine military is still fighting this long war, protracted war, and this is why they wanted a government that will have the same disposition as the Duterte administration. So makikita natin that they might support, or some of them have already formally endorsed or supported. Some of them are retired, of course, but we all know the retired active division is more a formal line than an actual division within the military. Some of them have already expressed preference for Marcos Jr. Because Marcos Jr. has categorically said that he will continue yung NTF-ELCAC. He will continue the fight against violent extremists, against terror. So basically copying Duterte's security agenda. The war on drugs will still continue, etc. So they see that Marcos Jr. represents. And they see that he is, since he is leading at least the surveys, that he has the best chance. Rather, even if you have supposedly another military trained candidate, Panfilo Lacson.
So maybe just a last question to sum up our discussion. I'd like now to ask you, for me, for example, as a voter, an ordinary citizen of the Philippines, why should I be concerned about conversations on the relationship of the military and politics in the Philippines?
Since the creation of politics, there's always been a dilemma as far as the military is concerned, because you are equipping an institution with the most violent tools, coercive means, most powerful tools and means, and what will, di ba, ang sabi, who will guard the guardians? What will prevent this empowered, this weaponized institution from using those exact instruments against the government, against the state, and against its people? So that dilemma is still there. No, the threat of the military, no, taking over is still there. Although I would say that it is at present very low risk, no, in the Philippines. I think the military has seen that while it can influence governance, no, it can influence security policy, it can dominate security policy. That's enough. No? And because it doesn't see itself as a messiah, it doesn't have, for me, it doesn't really have a messianic complex. If you will look back at the analysis in EDSA DOS in 2001, why did they intervene? Because they feared that there could be a communist takeover, right? Because there would be a power vacuum if Estrada is deposed from power. And this is why they sided with Arroyo, because because she's the constitutional successor, and she has promised that there would be no leftist takeover of her government. So, in other words, we know the trigger points of the Philippine military. What I fear is that in these upcoming elections, some elements have already red tagged some candidates, has already linked some candidates with the communist movement, even if the Duterte administration's Secretary of Justice has already expressed an opinion that there's nothing wrong with it. But regardless of that, there is such a McCarthyan anti-communist sentiment right now in Philippine politics that it is disturbing. It has shaped the minds through disinformation, that anything to do with the communist and even the broader term left is an enemy of the state. And that even includes the institution that we belong to, the University of the Philippines. So this is something that is quite scary because it's a slippery slope, right? And therefore, as voters, I think we should be able to cast our vote informed in a way that will not allow such thinking to continue. That will somehow make sure to remind the military that it must be subservient to civilian authority and not the other way around. But to also be very be very vigilant against civilian politicians who would invite the military into politics. So, and this is across, because I observe that it's not simply monopolized by one candidate. It seems like a lot of Filipino politicians have become so accustomed because it's normalized. For example, pag security matters, military lang yung kinokonsult. But national security is not it's not a default military area, because national security is civilian in nature. So hindi rin dapat tayo magpadala na pag military sila lang ang may alam sa national security, sa security policy, hindi yon, but that also means that we must be able to groom, train, educate, and equip civilian experts in national defense. Because if there's a critical core of those, then the military's monopoly could be challenged. And if you ask some of the military officials, they submit to civilian experts in national security and defense. Kasi sila din, alam nila at the strategic and tactical level lang or operational level, but strategic wise, policy wise, the military is not involved in those processes. It's civilians who craft that. So hopefully the elections will produce a government that is wary of the repercussions of having the military dominate policy making. They could serve as inputs. They could be consulted, but at the end, civilians must make security policy. Because if not, then we're just simply empowering the military who's already empowered in a way.
All right. I think with that, we can end this interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Aris Arugay, for agreeing to share your thoughts in this episode. Meron ka bang mga gustong i-promote or gusto mo bang sabihin na yung mga social media accounts where they can follow you or reach you?
Well, I have a Twitter account, Aris Arugay, at Aris Arugay. So I normally tweet about Philippine politics, and I regularly tweet about the upcoming elections. I also want to promote the Fulcrum blog of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, where I'm currently a non-resident fellow. We produce op-eds about the upcoming Philippine elections. And finally, I do hope that you'll also visit the UP Sahalalan webpage and social media of UP Sahalalan. This is an initiative of the University of the Philippines, and this is currently managed by the UP Department of Political Science. Our website and our SOCMED accounts have a lot of material, insights, analysis on the upcoming Philippine elections. So I hope that your listeners are able to tap into these resources so that they can have the information that could help them cast their vote on May 9th.
We would like to thank Aris for generously lending us his expertise and guesting in this episode of Hindi na Bago Yan. Watch out for a new episode every Saturday. For updates on the show, like, subscribe, or follow our social media pages. That's it for now. Have a good day.